Hey, everybody. Can you hear me okay if I don't lean totally into that microphone? Okay, terrific. Well, I'm Stephanie McCurry. I'm a faculty member in the history department, and I'd like to welcome you all here today on an extremely important day for the most recent event in the history department's ongoing series, In Conversation with Historians. This is, as I said, an ongoing series that the department started during the pandemic to provide an opportunity to address a historical topic and its contemporary and ongoing significance. So you can see how that resonates very well today. Today's event was planned long before the recent highly significant developments on our campus around the war in Gaza, which of course have brought the events of Columbia 1968 very much to mind, not just to us, but to reporters covering events here in the media. So the event today is our effort as historians to offer some reflections on 1968, that year, another year of world turmoil, and to place it in broad historical context. So we'll have four relatively brief 10 to 15-minute presentations by these four faculty members. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, and we're expecting to run for about till about 6:30, and then there'll be, I believe, pizza, and we'll have a chance to talk more informally afterwards. So let me introduce today's speakers, although looking around the room, I know some of you could give these introductions yourself. So Frank Guridy teaches in the Department of History and African American and African Diaspora Studies. His recent research has focused on sports history, urban history, and the history of American social movements. Since 2017, he's been teaching the course, some of you I'm sure know, Columbia 1968, which is an undergraduate research seminar on issues connected with the student and community protests that took place at Columbia and in Morningside Heights in 1968. Frank's next book, which is going to be published later this year, is called The Stadium, An American History of Politics, Protest, and Play. And it'll be out from Basic Books probably in the fall. Is that right, Frank? August. Kim Phillips-Fein, who is joining us on Zoom, is the Gardner Jackson Professor of History. She's a scholar of 20th century American political and economic history and a history of New York City. She's the author of Invisible Hands, The Businessman's Crusade Against the New Deal, and Fear City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of Austerity Politics, which I believe is mostly about the 1970s. She's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and some other ones, which I'm not even going to bother to mention. She teaches classes on the history of political movements of the left and the right, as well as the history of New York City. Camille, are you going third?
I think Hang.
Hang, okay. I'm doing this in order that my colleagues are going to speak. Hang Nguyen is the Dorothy Board Associate Professor in the History of the US and East Asia and Director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. She has also recently become the co-founder of Vietnamese Studies at Columbia. She's a very busy woman. She is the author of Hanoi's War, An International History of the War for Peace in Vietnam, the general editor of a 3-volume Cambridge History of the Vietnam War, and is currently working on a comprehensive history of the 1968 Tet Offensive for Random House. She is also a Board of Trustee member of the Fulbright University in Vietnam. And to my left is Camille Robcis, who is Professor of French and History. She specializes in modern European history with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, in France, intellectual history, cultural and legal history. She's the author of The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the French Family, and 2013, and Disalienation Politics, most recently, Philosophy and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, which came out here in 2021 and in France in translation just this year. She is currently working on a new project tentatively entitled The War on Gender. At Columbia, Camille teaches contemporary civilization, as well as courses on European intellectual history. So with that, I'm going to ask Frank to kick it off.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Thank you, Luino and Theo, for helping us put this discussion together. We've been debating all afternoon whether we should do this. And it seemed clear that there's a real need for a space to talk through what we're going to talk about, and obviously what's transpiring on that encampment now and what's happened, in recent months. So I'm going to talk about the Columbia part of the 1968 story. Complex, global. We will get a sense of those global dimensions today. And I'm just going to give us a sense of the issues that were at play, the causes, and what I think were the significant outcomes of the protests that transpired here 56 years ago, almost to the day, this precise week, actually. And I come to this subject as somebody who's not writing about this. It's really as a pedagogical exercise. And my course is really inspired by the History Department's Columbia University and Slavery class taught by Professor Ty Jones, Carl Jacoby, and Stephanie McCurry, and in the past, Eric Foner. And it's a course that really requires students, undergraduates and graduate students, if they want to take the class, to do research on any aspect of what transpired here 56 years ago and before and after. And I'm convinced that the 68 story is extremely important, and I think we've seen its importance on this campus certainly in recent months. You know, it is a new left, Black power, and community uprising against urban renewal all at the same time. Right? I mean, many times you think about the 68 protests here, and it tends to be associated, as it has been recently, with the anti-war movement against in Vietnam, of course. But there's many, many dimensions of the story that I'll just touch on briefly here, but really require a larger discussion, and that's why you should take my class the next time I teach. So, of course, a big issue, as I just said, was the movement against the U.S.-led effort to war in Vietnam in the mid-late 1960s. And we see on campus here, and I should say that these images, almost all of them are from our excellent Rare Book and Manuscript Library. This is an image of an anti-war protest, April 21st, 1967. And what students were mobilizing around was particularly Columbia's complicity with the U.S. military effort in Vietnam. Protests against CIA and ROTC recruitment on campus. And in particular, Columbia's membership in an organization called the Institute for Defense Analysis, an organization that was facilitating military research. The extent of the impact of the IDA is open to debate, but nonetheless, it symbolically represented Columbia's connection with the military-industrial complex, which of course predates the 60s, goes back to World War II, if not before. And student discontent with the administration, right? So what we see in the late 60s and 66, 67, and moving into 68, under President Grayson Kirk, the university inventing rules to prevent or control student dissent and protest on campus, right? This is a Columbia Spectator article from September 25th, 1967, which announces Grayson Kirk's ban on indoor demonstrations. And I should say that the organization that took the lead in these protests was the Students for the Democratic Society, SDS, right? But there were other organizations which were involved as well. Okay? At the same time, we see Columbia by 64, 65, 66, slowly but steadily recruiting more Black students on campus. And I should say, of course, this is pre-coeducational Columbia, right? So we're talking about a male student population, and Barnard, of course, where the women students studied. And of course, they took classes on both sides of Broadway, as they do today. So Black students arriving in this predominantly white institution, feeling a sense of feeling racism, feeling a disproportionate treatment from security, ID checks, et cetera. And that's creating this sort of slow bond developing among Black students moving into 1968. One of the major issues that galvanized the protest, which I'll talk about here, and it's relevant for a variety of reasons, was Columbia's decision to build a gym in Morningside Park, right? They leased land from New York City, the Parks Department in 1960 under direction at that time of Robert Moses. And it's a fairly non-controversial project. The idea is to build the gym for Columbia students and faculty, right? But by the late 60s, the question of the community's access to this gym becomes a big political question for Columbia, right? And city officials get involved. And eventually a decision is made to create a gym that would have a portion for the community, the Harlem community, and at the bottom level, and then the rest of it be for Columbia students and faculty. And this is a side view of the gym, looking up actually from, if you're imagining you're looking up Morningside Drive from 110th Street, right? And so what in the late 60s, separate entrances, right, acquired a racial, right, meaning, right? So organizers who were critical of this project for a variety of reasons start to say this is an example of Jim Crow segregation, right? And we see here's the blow up of the architectural plans, and here's the community gymnasium on the bottom. Once again, so this all of a sudden becomes a major political issue for the community and eventually for Columbia students. On April 23rd, 1968, students organized by SDS and the Student Afro-American Society gather for a rally at the Sundial to make their concerns heard. because at the time, students who had been disciplined and suspended for violating Grace and Kirk's indoor demonstration policy, and also for critiquing the gym and the question of Vietnam and Colombia's relationship to the military war effort. Their plan was to charge up and to storm Low Library. They found that Low Library was shut, locked, and somebody in the background in the crowd said, "To the gym." And all of a sudden, hundreds of students go down to the gym site, right? And they start to tear down the fences at the gym site, construction site. And so I want to do at this point is I want to really, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the extraordinary research, documentary work of Paul Cronin, a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School, who is largely responsible for much of our understanding of the Columbia 68 story in recent years. He edited a volume called A Time to Stir, published by Columbia University Press in 2018. And he put together a massive 15-hour documentary, which you can watch, and I encourage students to watch it. One day, it really should be a short documentary. It's an extraordinary film on the 68 protests here at Columbia.
To a meeting. At that moment, it became different.
It was a deeply symbolic moment because on this side of the fence is legality, politeness. I am part of the establishment expressing my opinion. And on the other side of this very humble chicken wire fence is trespass, the realization that we are called upon to do more than simply express our opinions.
It was just a chain link fence, but the fact of all the things that it represented when it was upright and all the things that it represented when it fell over became an internal transition for a lot of people.
I remember them pushing. I remember them feeling that finally they could grab the fence, but also grab history, grab the world, change it.
All of a sudden, there was all this energy.
I was really aware that I had crossed a line.
The crossing of the line.
An empowerment.
The line was crossed when you started to
This was not
compromise this property.
marching in the streets.
People weren't any smarter or more radical or more well-read than they were 3 weeks before, but they were willing to take more risks.
From a verbal articulation of concern
Physically doing something.
to a physical anger.
We can interfere with the construction of a gym that we think is inappropriate.
They've already pretty much done about everything you could up to a point. They're looking for a next step, and I think it fell into their lap.
The break between being passive and being more active, accepting strictures and reasoning with them as opposed to breaking them, that was a real turning point.
Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side. And it goes on and it says, then it is the brave man chooses, while the coward steps aside.
Each step became more and more intense.
Enough talking about all this.
Let's do it, people.
Let's make something happen.
Let's act.
Suddenly,
Let's move.
Something just happened.
Our timers were all on.
I had to take a stand.
The genie was starting to get out of the bottle.
This is what it was all about.
the dam broke.
Their anger was coming out.
It was going down. An act, you keep going, which broke a certain inhibition. The line was crossed when we became this group, this entity.
Suddenly things escalated.
This was no longer just a sundial rally.
Which was just, great.
All of us by then were what you would call action faction. There was no question anymore. You had to act.
Being militant at a moment when militancy would pay off.
Restraints have been pulled off.
Knowing when that moment is, that's very difficult. Sometimes you're militant and you get more isolated.
Putting not only your mind into it, but your body is important. It's exhilarating. It's, it's a level of commitment that you don't reach in the classroom. I think I was starting to feel powerful.
I'm not a one to go out and change rules. I'm one to obey rules and to try and work within rules. This was a different person from the Clifton Ladding who entered Columbia in 1964 or who was in Birmingham. When he was in Birmingham, he said, I can't go and demonstrate because they may put me out of school and I want to go to school. I want to be a doctor, or they may kill me. But at that time, in the spring of 1968, something happened that made me a different Clifton Ladding. In the South, I was not the person who caused the segregation and the lynchings. But I'm a part of Columbia, and what Columbia does represents me. And if Columbia is doing this to my brother in Harlem, that means I'm doing that to my brother in Harlem, and I could not take that. If I sat there and did not say something or do something, I would become a part of the problem. I would become the persecutor.
You could sense that we were crossing over a boundary. Once you were on the other side, you couldn't go back. It's the tearing of the fabric of society. Once you've taken that action, you've set in motion a series of responses. The consequences are just whatever they're going to be. You can't go back.
I did something very uncharacteristic. I took my whole dream. What I had had since the 8th grade, I took my whole dream of being a doctor. And I put it aside.
Okay, strongly urge you to see A Time to Stir by Paul Cronin. What we see in this clip are the protesters talking about their experience at the gym site, right? And the experience of taking their frustrations and anger and their concerns and what they felt when they grabbed that chicken wire fence. It's a very powerful moment. And one of the more powerful testimonies is from Clifton Laddie, who was a Black student here at the time. Somebody who was raised from Birmingham, Alabama. He was a class of '68. He was not somebody who's politically active. And he says, something happened to me in the spring of 1968. And he talks about his decision to step way out of character, right, to join the protest because he felt a deep connection with the Harlem community. What we see happening in '68 are these fascinating moments of solidarity making, right? Some of my students have heard me talk about this in my class, right? Not just between Black and white students, and that was the tenuous alliance which we'll talk about, but the ways in which the Black students are finding themselves as Black political actors, as representing the Harlem community as they saw it. Okay. So the protest is happening at the gym site, a student gets arrested, they come back to campus, they congregate, start a synod at Hamilton Hall, and they issue the 6 demands, right? And they can be summarized into 3 categories. One, around the university's complicity with the Vietnam War effort, a call for amnesty of students who have been arrested or suspended, a cessation of the gym project. Essentially, those are the 3 main issues that were at stake for the protesters. In the early morning hours of April 24th, the Black students asked the white students of STS to leave Hamilton Hall. And that represents, again, the ways in which Black power ideology was becoming influential among young Black students in this country in the late 1960s. It was also a tactical decision as well, because they really had no social commonality whatsoever. And so the white students, rather than go home and be aggrieved, they went and they took 4 other buildings over the next week, right? So 5 buildings on this campus were occupied: Fairweather, Math, Lowe, Hamilton, and Avery. And what we see happening in that period for the next week is an ongoing negotiation between the university and the student protesters. Faculty try to intervene. They don't do such a good job intervening. We'll talk about that later. Crippled by endless debate and the desire to be objective and neutral. And there's many things to say about that. Make a long story short, on the early morning hours, April 30th, Grayson Kirk, president of the university, and David Truman, the provost, decided to call in the police because a stalemate had been reached. And a bloody police bus, transpires. 700 students or so are arrested, 148 are wounded, and that brings an end to that phase of the '68 protests. The protests continue into the summer, into the spring, summer months. A commencement is held. Commencement's held at Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Grayson Kirk does not give the commencement address. The historian Richard Hofstetter gives it. Because they felt that it wasn't a good idea for Grayson Kirk to give the commencement address. An alternative commencement is held by students in Morningside Park, and then the crisis continues into the summer. So that's a thumbnail sketch of what transpired that spring, much more to say. Here's why I think this is significant. I think it's significant. Part of the reason why I taught this class is that although Columbia has this reputation of being an activist ivy, I'm not aware that this institution has really reckoned with that history at all. And part of what the class is trying to do is to encourage our students to take ownership of that story. Because there's ways in which it's not a well-known story, and it's only become well-known when there's a moment of political crisis like we've had on this campus this October. And in some ways, what we've seen in recent months are the ways in which this protest movement is taking authorship of the '68 story and using it for their own ends. What happens as a result of the protests? One, many of the goals that the demands were basically met. The university disaffiliated with the IDA. Wasson Kirk and Provost Truman resigned in 1969. The gymnasium project ceases, and that gym does not get built. The gym eventually gets built over here, right on campus. A Black Studies curriculum starts to develop on this campus. The second Black tenured professor is hired, Charles Hamilton, in the fall of 1968. And also very significant, we see the beginnings of democratization of university governance with the creation of the University Senate in 1969. Right? A new policy-making entity that represented different segments of the university, faculty, staff, alumni, administrators, and students. And what we see is a gradual democratization and deep faculty involvement in university affairs. Something that's been harder to be able to execute in recent weeks and months on this campus, I should say. Right? And of course, the question of Columbia's expansion to the surrounding neighborhood persists for years afterwards, right through the 1980s, when Columbia acquires what was the former Audubon Ballroom, where Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. And of course, with the creation of the Manhattanville campus earlier part of the century, in the early 2000s, until recently. So the question of Columbia's relationship to Harlem persists to this day. What also persists, though, is even though the university has not recognized '68 to my satisfaction, certainly in a public way, nonetheless, the memory of '68 has been alive on this campus for a long time. And what we see happening, and I tell my students this all the time, is the '68 story is an alternative history of Columbia. It's a story that alums, that students and faculty who care about these issues keep alive and are doing research and enhancing our understanding of that work. Not just Paul Cronin, but also Stefan Bradley's excellent book on the Black student movement here on campus. And we see again this legacy of activism on this campus persisting to this day. And I think for historians, I think it does a deeper dive into the '68 story allows us to rethink how we see the late '60s protest movement, right? The ways in which the Columbia story, I think, allows us to really reevaluate what we think the new left was and its relationship to Black power and its resonance on this campus and in New York City, what we think about urban renewal, tenants' rights, et cetera, right? There's so many dimensions of the story that really have just been started to be addressed. So I would invite those interested in it to continue to do the research, whether you take my class or not. And I think there's much more for us to discuss in terms of research and certainly its contemporary resonance that we see happening right there outside the encampment on this campus today. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. So Theo, can we get Professor Phillips-Fein on there? And I guess maybe we also want to go down there? Yeah, I guess we'll go down there.
I'm here. Can you guys hear me? I don't know if my video doesn't seem to be on and I can't start it. But if folks can hear me, maybe I'm going to try to share my screen at least. And I'd love to be able to see you guys, but maybe at least maybe you can see my slides, if not me. Great. Well, there's my slides. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up and let me know if I should go ahead or if I'm okay on audio and everything else? Either a thumbs up on the video or on
Not the audio. We have the audio.
the audio. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, I'm sorry. And you can see the screen as well. So that's great. Let me put it into a slideshow format. Okay, well, sorry to be speaking with you as a disembodied voice. I think that that the Columbia 68 protests are, of course, very much alive today. They were a watershed moment on the campus, but also, and I'm going to speak a little bit about their impact in the city and in national politics, because these events played a key role in American political history, and especially, I think, in the way that the very idea of the student protester and the legitimacy or lack thereof of student protest would become a guiding feature of American political life, both the way that the student would both as a subject and also as an antagonist and a foil. And I think thinking about this context for the events of 68 at Columbia can also help us to get a better sense of what both the similarities, but also I think some of the real differences between that moment and our own. So to step back just a bit, I think many historians see the 1960s as a period that, in a way, sees the emergence of the college student as a political actor, and as a sense of the role of the distinctive political role of young people more broadly in and out of college. This is in part a reflection of the major increase over the 50s and 60s in the sheer number of young people attending college. Not just Columbia, of course, but especially, most notably, the public universities, which see their major expansion during this time, the availability and accessibility and affordability of college education, thanks to the GI Bill and other federal programs. So in a way, the creation of a generation of people who have the common experience of separation from their parents and entrance into an educational institution. I would also note that the key central role played by young people and by students and by college students in the civil rights movement, both in the sit-ins in Greensboro in North Carolina in 1960 and the coffee shops that are often seen as kind of jump-starting a particular wave of activism that culminates in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts of 64 and 65, and also the role of both Black and white college students in the freedom rides of the early 60s. And then finally, and crucially for Columbia and the events of 68 here, the politicization of young people more broadly in the context of the military draft that was needed to fight the Vietnam War. College students were privileged in terms of the context of the war, especially in 68, because at that point, college students making academic progress were exempt from the draft. This ended in 1971. And I would note this is one reason probably why amnesty became such a vital issue at Columbia in 68. Losing student status actually meant that one became eligible for the draft. So it was very important for student activists to get amnesty at that moment. So I think these different features of the changing role of young people and students in particular around these three key aspects, the civil rights movement, the war, and the sheer number of people in college, and a sense that there's a special legitimacy to actions carried out by students. This vision, this idea underlays many of the actions and much of the politics of the 60s more generally. The name of the major anti-war student organization of the time, although it doesn't start out focused on the Vietnam War, Students for a Democratic Society, bears testament to this. Its opening lines about we are a generation bred in at least modest comfort, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit, invokes the image of a generation of people poised on adulthood, facing a new set of responsibilities, a deep set of responsibility about the world they come into. So I think this whole idea that students can make legitimate moral claims on their educational institutions, and that college students could and should organize politically to shape the world that they inherit, that there's a special role that the young have in this. This vision is sort of at the back of the student politics of the era. Before the Columbia protests, this was the core issue at University of California, Berkeley in 1964 and 65, which anticipates many of the events that unfold at Columbia, although with it was a different moment, a different place. This is a public university and a different register. But here we see thousands of students mobilizing specifically actually around the question of political speech. Can you have political speech on the campus? There were a whole range of speech codes and rules and regulations in the University of California system that limited very sharply what students could or could not do politically on the campus. And this became in a remarkable series of protests and demonstrations that develop all throughout the academic year of 64 and 65, the key issue at stake. This culminated in an occupation of a university building, Sproul Hall, that was met with mass arrests ultimately. Again, kind of anticipating what happened at Columbia. Now, at Columbia, and Frank gave an excellent description of the events here, I think it's worth noting that they unfold in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th of 1968, the uprisings in many cities that followed that event. And there was intense debate on the campus, which I'll talk about more in a moment, about the tactic of occupying the buildings. Many people criticized this, saying it was, it was unfair to people who weren't participating. It was not fair to students who couldn't go to class because they were actually in the buildings. It interfered with basic educational life. People described the students as irresponsible and also were afraid that such intense conflict would destroy the comedy of the academic community, a fragile, precious good. But I think it is actually worth noting that many people who objected to the strategy of the occupations still expressed a support of the underlying goals and implicitly saw the claims that the students were making as motivated by a sense of moral responsibility. And I can talk more about that later, but I think it actually was a notable, the sense that this was legitimate political action or motivated by a set of legitimate political beliefs, whether or not you thought the particular strategy made sense. The strategy of the campus occupation would appear again in subsequent years, often in New York in 1969 at City College, where Black and Puerto Rican students occupied the campus, demanding more racial equality in admissions, and then also echoing or kind of a call for a Black and Puerto Rican, especially, studies curriculum and department, among other things. This is echoed again in 1975 at Hostos Community College in the South Bronx. So the first of these pictures is another picture of students at City College, which is being kind of renamed Harlem University. And then the other picture is of people at Hostos Community College in the South Bronx, where students protested the planned closure of the school. Of course, it is also echoed in 1986 at Columbia and elsewhere with the protests for divestment from South Africa. So I think this tactic, this strategy is not limited to Columbia 68, but develops elsewhere. At the same time, almost as soon as it appears, I think we have to reckon with the fact that the idea of the legitimacy of student protest was also controversial. And campus protests become quickly mobilized as part of a conservative political reaction. This is not altogether new either. There's a long tradition in conservative thought of suspicion around the intellectual, the university. Most immediately in the 1950s, William F. Buckley first made his name with a book called God and Man at Yale, in which he criticized the campus culture of his alma mater, Yale, as politically dangerous and irreligious, influenced by communism in a variety of ways. So this is an idea circulating in the US. It has a deeper intellectual and political history too. And it manifests around the Columbia 68 protests. There were some students at Columbia in 68 who invoked a very politicized opposition. There was a group called the Majority Coalition, a term that anticipates and echoes Richard Nixon's idea of the silent majority, which he coins that phrase in 1969, saying there's a silent majority that supports the Vietnam War despite these noisy protesters. The Majority Coalition surrounded the occupied buildings with large crowds, trying to prevent food and other supplies from being brought in. There was also a student organization, a little bit more ideological almost, called the Committee for the Defense of Property Rights, which compared the occupying students and student protesters more generally to the Nazis, saying they are today's version of the Nazi thugs who seized power in Germany in the 30s. And that they weren't respecting property rights, which were the real source of freedom and order. And rather than amnesty, as we see this young man, they proposed criminal prosecution. The police bust was widely condemned in retrospect and is seen, I think, as a real moment of, or at least until recently, was really seen as a very shameful moment in the university's history. But at the time, the university got a lot more mail supporting the decision to bring in the police than it did criticizing this action. Here we see a letter from someone in Virginia. And in a way, which goes so far as to say the head cracking was necessary. This has, I think, we have to remember this had tragic consequences at the time. 2 years later, in May of 1970, the National Guard killed 4 student protesters and injured more at Kent State University in Ohio. 2 student protesters were killed at Jackson State University in Mississippi later that month. In New York, students who were participating in a nationwide student strike after the Kent State killings and the invasion of Cambodia organized a protest on Wall Street. They were greeted by a massive crowd of construction workers and office workers who proceeded to beat them up. And more broadly, even later in 68 itself, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, police used a great deal of violence against student protesters or young protesters, some students, some not. And in a way, I think there is this legitimation of violence as a response to student protest, or the sense that it was an available tactic, had deadly consequences at the time and in the years after, things that could not be taken back. It is also worth noting that this police reaction to the students helps to feed into the idea that opposition to the Vietnam War was limited to privileged students, while real blue-collar Americans backed it. Polls at the time and historical research afterward, show this is really not the case. Opposition to the war was a cross-class phenomenon and was much stronger actually among people without college degrees, which makes sense, especially since those were the people who who had to fight it for the most part. Finally, the vitriol against student protesters also had political legs. The leading conservative politicians of the time, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, portrayed student protesters as uniquely dangerous, irresponsible figures, inflamed by radical ideas, not committed to the sanctity of institutions, basically as ungrateful children. So in delegitimizing the idea of student protest. When he staged his first successful bid for governor of California in '66, Reagan ran promising to clean up the mess in Berkeley, and once he was elected, he fired Clark Kerr, the chancellor of the University of California system. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover investigated Kerr and conducted surveillance against him, viewing student protesters as the pawns of communists instead of moral political actors in their own right. Nixon also decried the bums, as he put it, blowing up the college campuses. And I quote, "The boys that are on the campuses today are the luckiest people in the world, going to the greatest universities. And here they are, burning up the books, storming around." This is a picture. Nixon was kind of obsessed with the student protesters. This is a picture from a remarkable incident in which in May of 1970, there were thousands of people, tens of thousands of people protesting in Washington, D.C., and in the middle of the night and camping out in the lawns there, in and around the Lincoln Memorial and on the Mall. And in the middle of the night, Nixon decided to go down and try to talk to the student protesters. He took maybe a couple of Secret Service people, but he really didn't tell anybody else that he was doing this. And he just went down to sort of talk to them. And you can see the slightly bemused expressions on some of their faces as he kind of tried to engage in dialogue with these people. And here we see, this is an image of once Reagan was elected, and as governor, he directed the mass arrest and also the bringing of National Guards people to crack down on student protesters in People's Park in Berkeley. And this is another, he kind of demonizing the students as communist sympathizers, sex deviants, and so forth. We can talk more about the long-lasting effect of this, but I think we can see just from this brief survey, the reaction against the campus protests of the 60s helped in many ways to generate and to drive the rise of the conservative movement that would ultimately bring Reagan to power in 1980. Conservatives tried to present themselves as the true forces of order, in contrast to feckless liberals like Kerr and Grayson Kirk, who let students get out of control. To step back, in 1968, there was no organized right on the national level on the scale that exists today and would exist after the rise of Reagan over the 70s and the Reagan administrations of the 80s. There was no conservatism, and all the subsequent history too. There was no conservatism in 1968 that had taken up, as the right has now, entrenched in a political party, academia itself as a major overriding enemy. The university administration did not in 1968 have to confront a hostile Congress. The matters of the campus were deemed essentially its own affairs and its own concerns. It did not have to confront deal with an extensive media apparatus determined to criticize all its reactions, or with protests at its gates organized by far-right religious figures. There are many reasons why the university, not just Columbia, but universities in general, are more vulnerable to campaigns today of that sort than they were then. But the rise of a deeply mobilized right, which has gained strength partly through its long opposition to student protest, has played, I think, a major role in the trajectory and dynamic of our current crisis. And this is also part of the long legacy of 1968. I'll wrap up there, but I'm really curious to hear what my colleagues have to say, and also what you all who I can't see there have to say.
All right, so I'll just jump right in. I also want to thank the history department, Louina, Theo, and especially Frank for organizing this event today. So I guess I'll start with actually 49 years ago today, I came over to the United States as a result of the end of the Vietnamese War. So right now, 49 years ago, I'm floating somewhere on an ammunition barge in the South China Seas, waiting to be rescued. So as we talk about anniversaries, it struck me that April 29th, April 30th is a huge anniversary for many of us personally. And I'm coming at this is very complicated because my next book is on the 1968 Tet Offensive and the battles that unfolded and its impact not only on the war in Vietnam, but also globally. And my scholarship might point one way, and what I want to say may point another. And in certain ways, it actually pulls from my teaching. So I covered the same events for my U.S. East Asian Relations class. Some of my students are here, as well as my Vietnam War and Wars for Indochina. And what I'm going to do that will separate a little bit is I'm going to focus on Vietnam's global revolutionary strategy. I'll leave aside the questions of the 1968 Tet Offensive if any of you have like specific questions about it. But the one takeaway that I want you guys to take from my comments is if Henry Luce stated, and we all know that he did, that the 20th century is truly could be called the American century. I contend that the second half of that century should be called the Vietnamese century, the Vietnamese half century, because no other small country had such an outsized impact on regional global affairs than Vietnam and the events that transpired in the post-1945 era. So that's the takeaway. But again, this might be a little schizophrenic because, like Frank, I didn't think we were actually going to have this event tonight, so I did not prepare. Before I forget, because I will forget, when I do teach this course when I teach about the 1968 protests in Colombia, I actually am nicer to Richard Nixon because I give him the last word, because for all of his faults, he did say, as opposed to other US leaders at the time, that no, what happened at Columbia is very, very important, that it shut down the first major university since the Vietnam War began. We have to take note of that. So again, I don't like the man, but I'll give him that, given especially Kim and Frank really went after Richard Nixon. Okay, so that is not my presentation. So if you could pull that up. No, that is Frank's. So so mine is Hang's PowerPoint, if you put them all in one. That's mine. Okay. Okay. So more there. You go back one more. No. There. No, back. All right. So again, what I'm just going to say is, as my colleagues have really focused on the anti-war movement, and particularly the anti-war movement in the United States on college campuses, I'm going to place it in the global setting because I think this is why Camille and I were brought into this panel. So you can see it from these images. In many ways, the Vietnamese Communist Party and the war leadership really utilized and at times created transnational revolutionary circuits. When the, quote, possibility of a militant and non-militant solidarity existed in the global arena. Now, this really picked up after 1968. I can say from all of my research in the pre-68 materials in Hanoi, they did not care. They did not invest that much in terms of resources in the diplomatic struggle, because the French Indochina War taught them that you could have the majority of the French public say that was a dirty war, but it would not end the war in Indochina on Vietnamese terms. And that's precisely what happened at Geneva. So they did not invest that much in the diplomatic struggle until 1968. But again, the vast majority of scholars really focus on the US domestic picture. And one of the things that, again, talking about 1968 is, I still remember when Ty and your parents were at this event. 2018, I was invited to speak to the class of 68 50th reunion. And in particular, was just blown away by the stories of people like Alfred McCoy, who is now a professor of Southeast Asian history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who writes about the CIA war in Laos, and in particular the Opium Wars. But his claim to fame was he was the first to get the Columbia patch, which I guess that meant, because he tells me, he's like, when you're in a protest, never sit in view of the doorway when you're the first person in. We all had agreed, and this is Fairweather Hall, that no one would get up when the riot police came in, that everyone would sit or stand their ground. So he was right. He didn't find anywhere to sit. He sat right where the doors open. And of course, the police, the riot police first came up to him. They said, move. He said, no, I'm not moving. They proceeded to crack his head open with the baton. As fellow protesters watched in horror what happened to him, and they kind of picked him up, they hogtied him and brought him out. He saw the other protesters one by one stand up when the riot police came up to them. Nonetheless, the hospitals at that time in 1968 were packed with student protesters who would get stitches and go right back out and protest for the remainder of the months that Frank and Kim spoke about. In the end, they did have it at Cathedral St. John the Divine, where my girls go to school. And again, they had a planned walkout. And you can imagine how difficult that was prior to, social media. But they planned it. There was a song they would play, and they all single file walked out of Cathedral St. John the Divine. I'll be looking forward to you delivering the commencement speech as a historian, and maybe if our president will do it. But again, I'm talking about Vietnam's revolutionary strategy. Next slide. Oh, I'll do it. I have this. But the most important and I don't want to downplay this, was anti-war protesters in the United States of America. Particularly after 1968, the extent of meetings and interactions with student protesters really picked up tempo after 1968. And all of this was about, the sort of Hanoi's people's diplomacy to try to end the war, end military intervention sooner rather than later. But it's really the global arena that North Vietnamese communist leaders had in mind. And, there really was, as they established connections with US protesters, American anti-war activists, the communist bloc, the non-aligned third world, and progressive segments throughout Europe and the rest of the West. These people's diplomacy not only brought about statements of support, but it really facilitated at times official aid and diplomatic relations for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam or North Vietnam. And, they had a whole, they had very, very talented diplomats in their arsenal. This is Nguyen Thi Ngoc Dung, and she was part of the sort of long-haired warriors in the diplomatic battlefield. She attended the Congress of Palestinian Women held in Beirut. During the war, Dung served also as the PRG representative to Paris. But really, when she told me, as I interviewed her later on, she said, the thing that woke me up in terms of my global revolutionary consciousness was eating an olive for the first time in a Palestinian encampment. And for here, she was like, whatever is happening to South Vietnam under American bombs and firepower, it's happening to Palestinians right now in what she said is occupied Palestine in the Middle East. And so in many ways, the North Vietnamese communists, and they say she's South Vietnamese, really had their own revolutionary global consciousness awoken during this time. I did have an image of the song, but this also went beyond just diplomats touring areas in the Middle East or in the United States or Europe, et cetera. Habib Jalib, a popular Urdu poet who spoke against military rule in West Pakistan, would face the same fate as in South Vietnam. In a poem entitled Vietnam's Burning, he wrote, "Oh, lovers of human rights, where are you? Humanity is on the edge. Vietnam is a light. Vietnam is a light. Don't be silent. Speak up now. The clouds of war are heading this way." So in addition, again, to Vietnamese diplomats visiting war-torn areas, also Urdu poets composing music, they also reached other fighters, again, in contested zones. Here's a picture of Leila Khalid, who is a member of the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine. She too was inspired by the Vietnamese Revolution. In her memoir, she recalled watching as, quote, small nation in black pajamas fought and defeated the strongest empire in human history. She concluded that the Palestinians must learn the secrets of the Vietnamese. And they did this through this image pictured here, turned upside down. That's a picture of Bao Nguyen Giáp and his writings that were translated in Arabic by the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Hanoi. I was able to speak to the editor at the time, and he remembers fiercely trying to find people who could read Arabic, could read Spanish, could translate into French, all these languages to really get these revolutionary pamphlets circulated worldwide. But the person who really most captures the Vietnamese Revolution, embodies it after Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969, is that woman pictured over here to your right side corner, Madam Nguyen Thi Binh, who was the foreign minister of the People's Revolutionary Government, as well as the head delegate who went, head to head with Kissinger. Kissinger hated her. I saw him in 2013, and he still couldn't stop complaining about that short woman, Madam Binh, who she and Le Duc Tho caused him to have all his gray hairs, he said to the Vietnamese delegation, whom he met at the State Department upon some 50th anniversary. And the reason is because she wouldn't back down. And she was a very, very articulate spokesperson in a demure al-yai with hair in a bun. Most of the time, the only woman in any sort of conference arena. This is an image of when the PRG, when the People's Revolutionary Government were invited to attend the non-alignment conference. The problem was it was being held in Gambia that year. PRG didn't have relations, so they had to tap on the Tanzanian president, and there she was flanked by not only the Tanzanian president, but also the head of Uganda, so flanked by 2 African heads of state to fly in to a non-alignment conference sponsored in Africa. And you can imagine how that looked. So PRG had the full support, at least, of radical leaders in Africa in this very important NAM conference. And this is her delivering her speech. And there is, after, she's standing up, and again, she's a very petite woman. Crowds are all like, wow, everything. Following her speech, amid the clamor and applause, Fidel Castro makes a plea. Madam Bin, he says, you have basically any Cuban warrior at your disposal whenever you need it. Just let Cuba know. Cuba and Vietnam have very, very close relations, along with Vietnam and Palestine. Even that still exists today when you look at the Havana delegation, as well as, I think, the Palestinian ambassador is the oldest diplomat in Hanoi today. Now, there are limitations to these sort of revolutionary networks. I'm not going to lie, and I'm happy to get into them if you're really interested in the sort of North Vietnamese leadership. But one of the things that, it strikes me is, at that time, these protesters globally, not only in the United States of America, but not only here at Columbia, but worldwide, were calling for the end of a horrific war, and also to promote social protest movements globally. And we, I think, are living through those times now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick so that we can have Q&A. But thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks for putting this together, Frank. Yeah, this is where it starts. So I was brought in to talk about the events of '68 in France. I think it's important that so much of '68 has been studied in this kind of national context, and I think it's really important to think of it as a global movement. Mexico City, we were hoping Pablo was going to be here to talk about that, but Eastern Europe, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Brazil, Tunisia, West Germany. So it's really interesting to see these moments, almost like 1848 also has these ramifications. 1968 is a moment like that. So for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about France, and I'm going to give you, my hope was to give you the context, like the immediate context, but also the broader context, and maybe think together about some of the lasting consequences of May '68. So first, the immediate context. The kind of trigger for May '68 in France is the post-war baby boom that is basically reaching universities. So the student population triples between 1948 and 1968, and they're all placed in these overcrowded facilities. The state cannot keep up with the student demand, and they build all these residential campuses outside of Paris. These are generally poorly designed, cheaply built, and kind of soulless. The prime example in '68 becomes the University of Nanterre in the suburbs of Paris. It's hard to get to it. There's bad transportation to the center, and there's no kind of cafes and the urban life that make student life pleasant. So the kind of that kind of contributes to the brewing unhappiness of the students. In addition, French universities at the time are characterized by a very, very authoritarian educational system. They're mostly lectures, like these kinds of lectures, with no seminars, very little interaction with professors. And so again, students start to complain about this. The thing that kind of triggers the movement of '68 is a group of politically engaged students that take the name of the movement of March 22, and they plan a protest to protest the Vietnam War on the anti-imperialist day. The students are sent to disciplinary councils, and the administration decides to close down the campus. So again, a lot of this, as I was preparing, really rings a bell. It's kind of eerie. So I'll just, many of these students are in sociology, which at the time is so they're very interested in social critique. And they include this character, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who's still actually involved in politics right now through the Green Party in between Germany and France. The movement spreads to the center of Paris, and it reaches the Sorbonne. So really at the center of Paris, students occupy the university. And interestingly enough, the kind of spark for the violence in the Latin Quarter is the fact that there's an extreme right group called Occitan, which is, think of it almost like the French Proud Boys of the time, planning a protest across the street. And the students, with the threat of violence, the students basically start to get sticks and cobblestones. This is an area that's full of cobblestones, so they lift them up. And the rector of the university panics, sends in the police. The students mostly cooperate with the arrests, but others get angry. There's tear gas, cobblestones, and more than 100 students wounded. So you see again the kind of police repression, and this is really no longer in the suburbs, it's in the very center of Paris, and the kinds of wounded students who, make the press writes about them extensively. Soon this becomes an issue of police brutality, and the students make it so. So this is one of the posters of May 68, right? The government sends in the CRS, which are the Republican Security Force, basically riot control police. This was a group that was very violent during the Algerian Revolution, and obviously the Nazi analogies of the students bring up during this. In the following days, the students build barricades around the Latin Quarter. And this is kind of, again, very symbolic because they turn over the cars, the symbols of modernity, right? You see the Citroëns and the cobblestones again. Lots of people are arrested, other wounded, and these are the damages to the cars, which again, the press really picks up on because it seems like, the cars are expensive, yeah. And the symbol of modernity. And it culminates, in the night of the barricades, this night. This lady does not seem happy about it. Students are suspended. Lots of support from the professors and the community, as you can see here. The kind of neighborhood support, and this is how kind of the neighborhood gets involved, and the Parisians. The workers and the unions eventually join the students, and you see here the students kind of calling for the workers to join them. Citroën is the brand of the car that they were turning over. And they call for a general strike. And there's an estimated 10 million people on strike in France during the year. This is the largest mobilization of French workers in history, larger even than the National Front. Huge protests on the streets in support of the strikers and the students. Again, this is a pretty famous image, but the point is that the country is completely paralyzed. So that's the kind of immediate context. Now, the broader context of this, I think it's important to put it in a more global framework. And I think there's two global axes here that intervene. And one is the Cold War, and the second is decolonization. And at the intersection is a crisis of Western Marxism, and a crisis that is both political and intellectual. The French Communist Party had been historically extremely subservient to Moscow. It was very slow to denounce Stalinism. So Stalinism was, kind of very authoritarian, and so was the French Communist Party, hyper-centralized, hierarchical. Their motto with the students was always, not you, not now, not yet. And obviously the students, don't agree with this. But the Communist Party also has a very complicated relationship with decolonization. And the example here is the Algerian War. The Communist Party was worried about alienating its working class electorate, which was largely in favor of colonialism and against independence. And it was also hard for them to endorse the Algerian Revolution because it was not exactly a communist revolution. It was kind of non-aligned and Islamic. So because of this, there starts to be a kind of drift between the students and the Communist Party. In addition, more and more students come to believe that the working classes in the West have lost the revolutionary spark. And so, there's a kind of revision to the classic Marxist analysis of that the revolution will happen in Europe, because that is where capitalism will reach its kind of point of crisis and then spread throughout the world. Instead, it seems that the real revolution is happening in the green zones in basically the third world, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so this is where, this moment known as third worldism, my CC students we all read Frantz Fanon this last 2 weeks. So this is when students start to kind of pick up on this idea of third worldism, also taken up by Sartre, who's the kind of hero of leftist French movements. And Sartre's own interest in Maoism, especially after the 1966 Cultural Revolution in China. So you can see how this idea of destroying the old order, right, and really rethinking ideology becomes really, really important for this revision of the left. Now, I should say in parentheses, and I think this links to some of what Hang was talking about, this is very much a fantasy of China that the French students are having. They are not especially interested in what is really happening in China, especially in the 3 million deaths that are occurring during this. But everybody is reading the little red book. Everybody's talking about ideological reform, and everybody, and so that all of these student groups take up these Chinese names, and basically Maoism becomes the way to be on the left without espousing kind of Stalinism. And so you see here, everybody, you know, China, and then all the other figures that, again, Hang was talking about, Che, Castro, as the kind of leaders of the real revolution, right? So all of this leads to a new way of thinking and of doing politics. All this, Marxism was about acquiring the means of production, but now the students argue it's not just acquiring the means of production, because clearly we have examples of communist countries and they're not particularly less ideological. So what we need to think is about the role of reproduction and the role of ideology in these processes of domination. And so why is it that people think the things they think? And so kind of what happens intellectually at this point is that they start to argue that the concept of exploitation is not enough and domination is not enough, that we need to think about alienation, right? We need to shift from an analysis of class to other types of subjection that are underpinning the social order. For example, the subjection of women to men, the subjection of children to their parents, the administered to the state, right? So the focus becomes the kind of technologies of coercion, of disciplining, of surveillance. And this is, of course, again, my CC class will recognize these, some of the figures who really do a lot of work, intellectual work, to think about you know, new ways of thinking about power, new ways of thinking, and a critique of a model of liberation instead of how power flows and travels. Students try to apply these principles directly to their political actions, right? So they organize in direct assemblies. They're self-managed. They do things like set up childcare system, distribute food, room distribution, etc. And Cohn-Bendit, it's interesting, he keeps on being asked by journalists to define his program. And he says that any definition would be inevitably paralyzing, because in fact, the disorder is what allows people to speak freely. So a kind of, you know, refusal to be pinned down to something. What happens is that increasingly there's a rift between the unions and the students. They start to have, it's clear that they have different concerns and different kind of missions. And this is the kinds, you know, and this is partly what the students think that taking the revolution to its logical consequence means. And they have taglines like, you know, be realistic, demand the impossible, or I love this one, life instead, or under the beach is under the cobblestones. On the other hand, the workers want things like better working conditions, better salaries, and you start to see a kind of split. The workers eventually decide to negotiate. These are called the Accords de Grenelle, and they're passed on at the end of May 27th. And they end up they're basically essentially very generous, 35% increase of the minimal salary, across the board wage rises of 10%, better work conditions, better hours, better family allowances. And this is actually interesting, again, to think about in relation to Kim's presentation, because de Gaulle, who's in charge at the time, dissolves the assembly, calls for new elections. And in fact, it's a huge landslide of the right, a huge landslide victory of the right. In fact, the biggest majority that the right has had since 1871. So, you know, there's something, again, to be said about these moments of revolutionary hope, and then the kind of the reaction, the kind of the Marxist Brumaire story. But the students after this especially are even more convinced that what we need to think about is this question of ideology and how do you decolonize your mind. So I just want to end on these two examples that the students kind of give to think about this question of because decolonizing your minds, they argue, is really leads us not just to questions of law, but to questions of norms. Like, how do we rethink the norms that guide our everyday life? And what Foucault will call the fascism in our heads. And so here, one book that comes out around this period, which is very important, is Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, where they say that basically they write this book inspired by the failure of May 68, by the fact that there's something in the air that emerges and that gets squashed down, not just by but not just by kind of the state, but by the unions and the political parties themselves. That the workers are not taking the kind of the revolution to its logical consequence. because in their case, they're blocked by what they call Oedipalization, your attachment to the heterosexual reproductive family that kind of, channels your desire in a particular way. But the two examples I wanted to end with is one is feminism and the women's movement, which in France is really a kind of legacy of May 68. So this is the birth of the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, which comes out of these Maoist leftist groups at the university. At the meetings, several leftist students start to boo the women who are in the audience, and they claim that feminism is secondary to the class struggle, that sexism would end with the revolution, and that the best role for women is to be the lovers of revolutionaries. This is a classic. And the women get up, march furiously out of the room. And this is, in fact, what makes them realize that sexism is
She got it.
That sexism is a really specific problem that cannot be mapped on to class. The MLF's first public action is to drop a bouquet under the Arc de Triomphe for there's all these monuments in France for the unknown soldier of World War I so this is like for the one who's even more unknown is the wife of the fallen soldier. So they put and then they start to have consciousness raising meetings all over the schools. And they start this journal, which is actually fabulous. And they have them all at Barnard. So again, this is a good project for anyone looking for a senior thesis. It's called the Torchon Brûle. And really, like, as they say, it's like the goal of the movement is to try to like understand how understand how norms work and how they operate at the level of bodies themselves and of behavior. And the last example I wanted to end with is the homosexual front of the homosexual Front d'Action, Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire, the homosexual liberation front, which comes out of the women's movement. Actually, they kind of split from them, and it begins as a subgroup, and it's really not about integration, not about tolerance or acceptance, but about exploding a social order that they despise. So the idea is, again, to kind of they have this motto that is as you can see, anti-norm. This is one of their journals, to think, and proletariats of all countries, caress yourself. So a kind of revolution that would go through norms, through desires. And so anyway, so that's, I think, and what, there's been an enormous historiographical debate about whether May 68 in France was actually emancipatory, conservative, the beginning of the end, and I think it, to some extent, for me, as I see it, I think this renewal of politics and of intellectual life was extremely important, and especially the kind of intersections of theory and politics that we saw. And I think this is also something that struck me as I see the students protesting now. There's been a lot of press about this, even in the Times last weekend, right, about what are the students reading, right? So again, I'd be curious to think about this together, but I think, partly we see how the politics and the theory are really intersecting, not one leading the other, but the two kind of mutually growing at this moment. Thank you.
According to that Times columnist, you're all reading the wrong thing.
Exactly.
It was quite clear. They were reading the thing she was just talking about.
I know you're reading.
Anyway, we'll go directly to the Q&A, and we ran long, but I think these presentations were very much on point and fabulous. So we'll maybe take 20, 25 minutes of questions, and then we can go have whatever pizza and whatever's out there for us. So please just, Theodore, are we going to do it with microphones or no?
That's
okay,
fine, yeah.
So just put up your hand and we'll go very casually this way. I want to share one little thing. It is true that in 1968, I was living on the Falls Road in Belfast. And so I remember the nightly news very, very clearly. Every night the news would come on at 5 o'clock. There was no TV before 4. And it would go from one country to another and the world was on fire. And they always did Belfast last. So I always, the BBC always did Belfast. Yes. Did Belfast last. So my talk about a global perspective. But the other thing is that when I got this position at Columbia University in 2015, my undergraduate professor, who was a Vietnam War refugee to Canada, so 1968 refugee himself, sent me a packet of Spectator physical newspapers from 1968, and he was a student at Stanford. So it shocks me to hear you say that has fallen away, the knowledge of that, because it seemed that students all over the country were paying attention to Columbia in 1968, and I have those in my office. They're amazing, and the spec has been amazing in recent weeks. So total call out to the spec.
Yes.
We're very proud of our own student newspaper here. So comments, thoughts, questions, reflections? Yes,
Okay.
please.
You talked about the fact that Black protesters when they occupied Hamilton, they basically told like white students like to leave, and I wanted to know like how did those racial conflicts develop with protests, and specifically the Black Power movement, and whether or not you think that served to isolate those students rather than create a more collective working class?
Yeah, great question. So as I said, Stefan Bradley's book, Columbia University versus Harlem, and the work of Paul Cronin has really enhanced our understanding of the role of Black students in the '68 uprising, because at Columbia, because it really had been seen mostly as a white student affair. And I think what we've seen as a result of that research is that actually many argue now that the role of the Black student occupation in Hamilton actually enabled the protest to last as long as it did. Precisely because, as Kim mentioned, this is just a few weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King. This is when, in the mid-late '60s, when urban uprising happening all over the country. And this institution was terrified that Hamilton Hall would spark a Black uprising, right? Because the students had connections with Harlem activists, with Harlem politicians, with national politicians like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, among others. And so actually it becomes this kind of fulcrum, right, that enables, that really causes the administration to really pause and think long and hard about how to respond to the crisis, right? And the other thing I would say too is, and again, this is also because of the influence of Black Power ideas. The book Black Power by Charles Hamilton eventually becomes a faculty member here, along with Stokely Carmichael, becomes very influential for Black students at the time. So at the and it is striking that, you know, even though you would think that they would have stayed together in that building, but they really had no organizational, social commonality whatsoever. It was very much a tenuous alliance, and yet it lasts, right? Once the students leave and break into Low Library in the early morning hours of April 24th, right? So actually the split contributes to the effectiveness, I think, what most people argue now, of the protests. Even though it looks from the surface of a kind of divisive gesture, but really at the time, if you watch the Cronin documentary, you see very clearly that there was very good reasons for that split to happen from a strategic standpoint.
And the numbers of students would have been very small, right? Black students at that
Black
point.
students, we're talking about a couple dozen, right?
Yeah.
But Hamilton Hall becomes a space where Black folks in the community are coming to bring food, and this amazing sort of solidarity that's happening as a result of Hamilton Hall. And it really creates problems for the administration at the time. The fact becomes identified as a Black space becomes a way that enables the protest to be in some ways successful, or something last as long as it did.
Yes, please, in the blue t-shirt.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, please, in the blue t-shirt. Okay, just to repeat the question quickly, the student is asking about whether there's any parallel between the attempts of the government I presume you mean the federal government or national parties, to suppress student protest in 1968 as they're doing now.
For Kim, maybe? Or
That would be for Kim, I think, if she's still there.
Kim, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
She is.
Yes. It's actually very, I mean, there is, I mean, but in a lot of ways, the most dramatic is really through the FBI at this moment. This is kind of the high moment of the COINTELPRO program. And I can recommend Beverly Gage's remarkable biography of J. Edgar Hoover, G-Man, which has excellent, those kind of inside description of this, both of Hoover's surveillance of the civil rights movement, of Black Power organizations, and of the New Left. And in a way, that is the most, the deepest and most extensive federal participation. There is no congressional hearings analogous to what we see today. One thinks of that earlier in the McCarthy era, which had a different set of dynamics, not as focused or not as directly focused on student protest per se. So I think the reasons for that are kind of interesting, but I do think it's I think it's quite a different dynamic at this moment.
Hey, Kim, I was wondering about this. Do you think if we were talking about state governments in the South with student demonstrations and organization in the South, we would have a different answer? I mean, desegregation efforts?
Right. They're definitely, I mean, so, I mean, yes, there you see, I mean, obviously state governments play a major role trying to prevent desegregation of universities as well. And thinking of George Wallace, governor of Alabama in particular, but really throughout the South. And it made, but I guess, so yes, I think that is a difference. I mean, that's a different situation. Yeah. But I do think, I mean, I guess it is, for me, it is one of the striking features of the current situation that is, I think, and the University of California also is you see a certain kind of mounting repression there. And public universities as well have a different relationship to all of this than the private universities do. But still, I think it is one of the, in a way, it feels like a different dynamic.
Yeah, that's very true. Rinaldi.
Question, I read that over.
Yes.
And this kind of question, this fixation of what students do. It seems like, I mean, I'm curious how this plays out in 68, in part because it seems like there are texts circulating in conversation, there are these two publications, and then there's a question of what's actually being taught in the classroom. And I'm wondering both kind of student efforts to kind of produce and circulate text, but then also was there a level of repression? Were there like attempts from the administration or government to spirit?
So the question for those of you on Zoom is whether Mrinalini is saying that the question of what students were reading and the translations and what is circulating and how much of that is taught at the curriculum level and how much, and yeah, what are students reading? That's really interesting. And I don't know, in the French case, I am sure they were not reading this in the curriculum. They were not reading Fanon in the curriculum, let's say, but I think that what there is, though, for example, the university that they create in the aftermath of Vincennes, which they create in the aftermath of May 68. Vincennes is a direct response of May 68, and they really try to revise. For example, students can get in without the baccalaureate. There's smaller seminars. They start to, and this is where, all of the kind of big names of French philosophy, they have teach Foucault, Castel in sociology. So there's a kind of provides a space of critique, psychoanalysis. There's a whole department of psychoanalysis. And so that you can see the curriculums there, and they are starting to kind of, decolonize in some ways the curriculum to some extent and to make them read and to also rethink the relation between professors and students. This is something, for example, that Deleuze, who teaches there, was really interested in, right? Like, how do you think about the kind of power in the classroom in ways that are more fluid, et cetera, et cetera. So there is definitely kind of some attempt to do that, but I think the kind of massive change of the university curriculum is a second step.
What you guys want to
jump in real quick?
Yeah.
You want to say something? You say something.
I was just going to say, so I study American presidencies, and under LBJ and Nixon, they believed that the Vietnam anti-war movement was led by communists, and we all know those stories, Operation Chaos, et cetera. So there was a program from the very top, domestic program, to try to undermine the anti-war movement. And we have evidence of that through all the declassifications, the millions of pages of documents. The second thing I would say is that these groups like SDS and other anti-war movements, and also Women Strike for Peace. So it's not just students, but it's also mothers, grandparents, et cetera. That at the time, a lot of these person-to-person meetups, conferences, it was all about exchanging or hearing testimonies from the Vietnamese, because again, this was before social media. So just to even get proper reporting at the ground level, at the village level, was of primary importance to these, in-person conferences.
I just have to chime in here because it might be surprising, but a few minutes before the clip I was going to show you, one of the alums, a couple of alums say this, that they were inspired to protest by what they were reading in CC.
Yes.
That just shows you the power of interpretation. Real, right? Like the quote is, all the lessons we learned in the classroom, we decided we had to enact on campus. Right? Which leaves the line no trillions of the world, faculty teaching and CCC myth. Like, how did they come to that conclusion?
And actually,
it shows you, right? I mean, as repressive as one can be about literature, one never knows how we reinterpret it.
yeah, just one quick word about CC. Also, the other thing that CC has come up recently is when President Shafiq was asked about the Bible, whether Columbia was going to be cursed by God, and I was thinking, they all read the Bible in the Columbia College, actually.
Know that.
I'm
not sure she knows that yet.
They all read Genesis. They all read the Bible.
Actually, I was just on the topic of the
Kim.
yeah, just on the topic of the Nixon and Johnson and the association, or describing the real unwillingness to take seriously the legitimacy of the student protesters and describing them as just pawns of communists. But I mean, I think that's true. I think it's also worth, I mean, I think they were, both Nixon and Johnson were deeply affected by the student protests, and the student protests came to be an important part of the political calculus, I guess, unfolding around the war, and whether it was going to be possible to continue to fight it. So I think we know that also from the documents that have been declassified. And also worth noting that earlier in '68, of course, Johnson says he won't run for re-election again, and there were different things that influenced him, but certainly the sense of a mounting opposition was part of that.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that, for obvious reasons, Camille's presentation focused on the realm of ideas and particular authors and ideas, but Frank was touching on the question of sort of a more institutional change and the building of Black Studies programs. First women's studies program in the United States is at San Diego State. I don't know what year that is, maybe 1970. It's extremely early. There are no materials. What are you going to teach? So people are writing the things they need to teach. They're literally teaching pamphlets. They're making anthologies of documents. We still use some of them. There's one from like 69 or something called the Feminist Papers, which is just excerpts of one thing after another that you could still teach a great course out of. So the materials and the readings are being produced out of the programs that are there, and mimeograph machines are going all night long. And it's a part of the movement, really, in that sense. There's not that much gap between, formal academic production and student generated and collaborative movement generated materials. Please.
What we've seen on Columbia's campus, there's tension. Obviously, residents of Harlem as well as students on Columbia, and then Black students on campus versus like this more middle class white students population. And then obviously transportation, we see kind of the worker and student separation. So I'm curious, in the right wing movement or the more conservative movement, is there this kind of class cleavage, and kind of what kind of variable?
Yes, this student is asking about the class and racial cleavages among between the student movement and, say, minority or working class populations where the universities are cited, and whether there were similar divisions on the right wing side in terms of opposition. Did they also split along class and racial lines?
That seems like a Kim Phillips-Fein question.
Kim, can you take this one? Maybe she's making dinner by now. Anybody else want to take a shot at it?
I don't know. It's a good question. It's a great.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to echo Kim's point that the right in that period is, I mean, drawing from this the scholarship I know, it's very much, reconstituting itself in formation, right? And it's not, the majority coalition and these folk who are at least on campus here who are opposed to the protests, they're not a well-articulated right wing, I would say, right? I mean, you see the seeds of it there, absolutely, right? And you see how those are the people who wound up voting for the Nixons and Republican candidates, and you've seen that larger realignment to the Republican Party that's happening in U.S. politics at the time. But they're not a significant factor, in the way they are now. I think what we're dealing with now is a much more powerful right wing apparatus, which is, as people have said, which is the Republican Party and those who are affiliated with Israel who are aligned with that politics. And it's a very potent combination that we saw on our campus when Mike Johnson was here in the Providence last week, right? There's just no analogous situation in 1968 here. And I think as I see this moment, now I'm going off on a tangent, I see we're reckoning with the larger process of securitization and the curtailment of our rights since 9/11. Right, the ways in which things have been taken away from us, and that allows for the surveillance and the repression that we've seen on this campus in recent months, right? So it's very much a decades-long process, so that when we had our 50th year anniversary gathering, we had a panel of students from 2018 with the 68ers, and it was very interesting when we talked about what was common and what was different in terms of activism and obstacles, and I would argue, and I agree, that we're facing a much more potent repressive apparatus than the 68ers did. The 68ers could just break the window in Low Library and boom, they're in the building. Not that case, not that way.
No swipe cards?
Right? I mean,
Post-pandemic surveillance.
I mean, I don't want to underestimate the power of informants in the FBI at that time. I mean, certainly they were potent, but I think we're dealing with much more, a much powerful, I would say, surveillance apparatus that enables a kind of institutionalization of right-wing politics.
I mean, I would say that's 100% correct, but that I think, again, if you want to know where the right was in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, the right on the South, the core of the conservative movement in the United States has always been an Southern white resistance to emancipation, Reconstruction, desegregation. That was highly organized. It was very repressive against state schools in the South. I don't know enough about the private universities to know. And so that was the core of the right, but that's not the right that we have now. It's not the new right that Kim was talking about and gesturing to as emerging from this crisis. But you can see how Nixon came out of that world, how there's certain Boston versions of this. And there's very complicated class and racial politics on the right in those places too. Theo.
They're asking, what did solidarity look like in the 1960s? Especially with the role that Asian Americans played in the protests, seen as they see anti-war soldiers back. But a larger question is, how can we learn from this movements of solidarity, particularly ones that are transnational, to send the folks back on what's currently happening?
Gotcha. Great question for us for now.
Can we articulate that question?
I think it's.
Can the Zoomers see that?
So I think,
Yeah, it's on the chat.
In the chat,
Yeah.
okay, that's a long question.
That's for Frank.
Oh,
right?
okay, great.
Frank or Hang?
All right, really quickly, this is when Asian American was coined is during this period in 1968 onwards. But one of the books I can always point people out to read, Judy Wu, Revolutionaries on the Road, looks at Asian American participation in the global anti-war movement. In particular, help me out, my students, of the 1971 visit by Black Panthers headed by Eldridge Cleaver also included 2 Asian Americans, Tatsumi and other name, Hang, who was here in New York City living in Chinatown. So my students always go and interview him. So I apologize for forgetting his name. But yes, there were very loud Asian American voices, particularly here in New York City, but especially in California. Now their politics, particularly at least for the delegation who went, it was varied. But yes, there were Asian American, there were back then what would be called Chicano American voices in the anti-war movement. So it was beyond just black and white.
Just to echo, absolutely. I was going to pick up on where you left off, Professor Nguyen. yeah, in some ways, the literature has already moved beyond the black-white boundary, binary, I mean, to the point where it's almost irrelevant in my mind. So the way I think about the freedom movements of the 60s, of the second Reconstruction, as historians have called it sometimes, that you are seeing, transnational, transracial, multi-ethnic movements happening at all levels, and including around questions of sexuality and feminism, right? I mean, I think you have to, so Camille mentions that in the French case, but we see very similar dynamics happening here in this country, of course, right? So I think that the thing about that period is that, it may be in certain mainstream ways of teaching U.S. history, it might seem like just the history of the Black freedom struggle, and no question it was central. But the scholarship now shows how powerful and multivalent and dynamic those movements were, and their vexed, complicated relations they had with states like Vietnam and Cuba. Right? I think that the points here are well taken around fantasies and the ways in which those movements were projecting certain things onto those states that really didn't match up to the policies of those states too. Right? So I think that's an important point as well. So I would encourage that person to read a number of texts that are really showing how these movements have the complexity of these movements.
I was just thinking, listening to that question, that there seemed to be an undertow, which is, if I'm hearing correctly, which is what happens when student movements draw media attention, and then the war that's that's the cause becomes the background. And I think this is a very big danger that we're in. The coverage in the United States right now is shockingly focused on what's going on Columbia's campus and everywhere else, and the protest is not about Columbia's campus. The protest is about the United States and its involvement in a war and connection with Israel. I think we'll take one more question and then we can all go outside, and please, you've been very patient keeping that baby asleep.
Multitasking.
Association and some other associations. And I was one of the speakers. See, you guys think the protests of your generations are like pretty loud. So we got some of the people who did protests to come back and share experiences. And in fact, there was this one white guy that said, we actually learned a lot from the black students in Hampton, but we were pretty happy with the kicking us out. And instead it was because they were so much better at keeping university property intact than the white students who took over the other homes. But anyway, just moving on that, and because the questions today, I think they were a little bit more academic. I think the questions on that day were a bit more practical and direct. They were just asking simply, what could we learn from you? What should we learn from you? So I just want to pass the question back, maybe as final, and still things are going on now today in a different way than things were in February. Like maybe you could also just answer like, what questions should students be learning from this date that they may not be learning? What questions should administration be learning from this date that they may not be learning?
Oh my God.
I think we thought they learned.
Yeah.
And
How
then
much
they
time
did
do we have?
Not at all. That was like 5 questions. The easiest one is to address what the university should be learning from 68. They have not learned.
Don't call the police.
Anything.
Yeah.
They've learned how to lock down buildings to prevent occupations, but they're more disconnected from students than even Grayson Kirk and Truman and those people were in those days. I'm really convinced. So these days were scholars who had some sense of what the scholarly enterprise involved, and I'm not convinced we've seen that for our administration, certainly, or around free speech, or even how university people, students, and faculty think. So that's the easy one. They have not studied 68. They have no connection that I'm aware of, although I'm not involved in the inside, but I'm not convinced they have. I think that our students are learning the lessons of 68. I think we've seen that over and over again, and even if they're viewing it just from their own contemporary circumstance, I'm fairly convinced that a number of them have really learned some lessons very well. And I think that's a credit to them, actually, and their ability to grasp history and make it speak to their time, and in some cases do research on it as well. So I think that that's been happening. That's what I would say.
I'll be really quick. So I was invited to this teach-in. I couldn't make it because it was right around the time that my institute was organizing the 75th anniversary. So of course I gave them my visiting scholar from Fulbright University, Vietnam to the Institute, Hoang, who did a phenomenal job. And one of the things that, you know, I would agree with, I mean, they didn't learn because you don't send in the police, that first and foremost. The second thing that I would say is, you know, one of the fears of, I think, the faculty prior to this moment was that the pandemic, the endless recessions made the younger generation sort of apathetic or powerless to change anything. And there was this sort of grievance culture that crippled. And I don't blame this generation. Again, millennials are the first to see that they will not overtake their parents in terms of, you know, just wealth, et cetera. You won't be able to buy houses, but so that crippled. And what we see now, you know, you agree or not, but students again are motivated, they're organized, they're agitating. And, you know, that was what really hurt when there was a crackdown on that, because for so long, the rest of those of us sitting here was just like, when will that change? And, you know, just being battered by so many, you know, sort of global disruptions. Yeah. This has been great because the fear was that the apathy would overtake, and that lack of just even interest in international affairs. And that was on the road to 9/11 that we had heard that Americans just don't care about anyone except for themselves or maybe Europe and what's happening. Again, you know, one of the things I would say is I don't want to get in the weeds of my own research. There are limits to applying what happened during the global anti-Vietnam War movement to today. The North Vietnamese, you know, at the time was a police state that clamped down on their own students and own anti-war activists. And there was just voluminous examples of how there was just cultural misunderstandings between the Vietnamese who were allowed to meet with these anti-war protesters. But I didn't want to talk about that today.
I mean, just to add, I think, to what you were saying, I think the danger of romanticization of the kind of the rest of the world, or a kind of an attempt to read the rest of the world with an American grid, I think is dangerous. And I think, again, this is a call out for the history department. I think one of the things we teach our students is to precisely understand different contexts, different periods, and to try to learn about, you know, different regions of the world, which doesn't mean we can't ask questions about the present, but to also take that specificity into account. So I think this speaks to this moment too. But I will say that for me, at least, you know, the similarities between these moments are really fascinating, because the students were in some ways at the avant-garde of the protests, and retrospectively, you know, I think we could say we were thankful for them to bring to light the political crisis that was going on in the world. And, you know, similarly, I think that there is something about the students, as you said, like kind of not being apathetic and actually speaking to, I mean, being politically engaged citizens of the world, which is what I hope we're teaching them to be also, you know, like to give them the tools to become these active citizens, and that is part of education, but also to care. And to that extent, I think that you know, that's how I see our mission here.
Well, I think listening to all of my colleagues here today and reflecting on what's going on outside in the encampment, that everybody who spoke touched on both reaction, the brutal reaction that came after this. So we're worried. But they also talked about the intellectual work and political work that came out of it, which takes time to see. And some of it might be here on our own campus. We don't know. And I think, you know, it's not so much what's the direct resonance with 1968, but what we know is that it's an incredibly, what's the word, productive or protean moment. And we can talk all day about how we got here. And I think there are many crises. Frank, I think you were right on about, you know, securitization and so forth, because it's hard to roll that stuff back. You know, we've been asking the university for 2 years to dismantle the swipe card access to campus. Now we know why they won't. They got it, never waste a crisis. They got it in when we had those attestation forms for the pandemic, and they're not going to take it away. But I think, you know, both in terms what's coming next, I think these reflections on 1968 both give us cause for hope and for real worry about what comes out of a moment like this, where there really is direct conflict between the institutions and the students, also the faculty, as a matter of fact,
and
but the federal government in this case, newly organized against the university, or at least part of the federal government. So these are somewhat new circumstances, and but we know from the past, good and terrifying things will come out of it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Hopefully we have pizza and
Yeah, pizza and
wine.
drinks.
There's no wine because it's rich. Yeah, fantastic.